Imagine this: a German colonel, weary from endless retreat on the collapsing Western Front, suddenly finds his men in possession of a massive cache of American fuel, 50,000 gallons of it. For a moment, there's triumph. This was liquid gold, the very lifeblood of modern war. With this fuel, tanks could roll, trucks could move, and aircraft might once again take to the skies. But instead of celebrating, the colonel grew silent. He knew what it meant. If his men could stumble across 50,000 gallons of fuel, just a drop in America's ocean of supply, it proved something terrifying. Germany wasn't simply losing battles. It was losing against an enemy whose resources were so vast, so inexhaustible, that the war was already decided. This is the forgotten story of how a single German officer, standing before an ocean of captured gasoline, realized in that moment that Hitler's Reich was doomed. The German war machine was built on speed, surprise, and the promise of overwhelming strength. In the early years of World War II, it seemed unstoppable. Panzers rolled through Poland, smashed into France, and drove deep into the Soviet Union with a momentum that stunned the world. Blitzkrieg became a legend, a storm of tanks, aircraft, and infantry that appeared to operate with limitless energy. But beneath the thunder of engines and the flash of mechanized warfare, there was always a hidden weakness gnawing at the heart of the Reich. It was not a lack of courage, or discipline, or even technology. It was fuel. From the very beginning, Germany waged war with a gas tank that was never quite full. Unlike the United States, which sat atop vast petroleum reserves in Texas, California, and the Midwest, the Reich possessed little natural oil of its own. Hitler and his generals knew this from the start, and every major campaign was shaped by the desperate hunt for fuel. When German forces swept into Poland and France in 1939 and 1940, they were not only seizing land and cities, they were seizing refineries and stockpiles, desperately trying to keep their armored spearheads moving. The panzers may have symbolized modern war, but in truth, their success depended heavily on captured gasoline. By the time the Wehrmacht turned east and invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the problem had only grown more severe. The drive toward Moscow and Leningrad masked a deeper strategic obsession: the oil fields of the Caucasus. Hitler believed that unless Germany could capture Baku and the Caspian Basin, the Reich would eventually grind to a halt. He was not entirely wrong. The German army consumed hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil each month, and production at home could not keep pace. Synthetic fuel plants, which converted coal into liquid fuel, worked around the clock, but they could never match the scale of America's oil industry. By 1942, every panzer division, every Luftwaffe squadron, every U-boat flotilla lived with the constant shadow of scarcity. The shortages shaped everything. Tank crews were ordered to conserve fuel by limiting unnecessary maneuvers. Luftwaffe pilots, once accustomed to endless training flights, were increasingly grounded, their hours in the air slashed as aviation gasoline dwindled. Even the mighty Tiger and Panther tanks, masterpieces of German engineering, often sat idle on the battlefield, abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because they had simply run out of fuel. Photographs of hulking armored vehicles left behind in the mud of Russia or the fields of France captured a bitter irony: Germany could build fearsome machines, but it could not always make them move. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the United States was drowning in oil. American refineries pumped out millions of barrels a day, shipping petroleum across two oceans to feed not only its own armies but those of its allies. British bombers ran on American fuel. Soviet tanks charged forward on gasoline shipped from American ports. Even China's battered armies received fuel from U.S. reserves. It was a war fought not only with bullets and bombs, but with rivers of petroleum flowing from the heart of American industry to every corner of the globe. For German soldiers on the front lines, the contrast was unavoidable. They saw American convoys, endless streams of trucks and jeeps and tanks, all fueled without hesitation. They watched Allied aircraft circle overhead in greater numbers than seemed possible, never worrying about conserving gasoline for tomorrow's mission. Every engagement reminded them that their enemies operated with a freedom of movement that Germany could not match. Where the Wehrmacht rationed, the Allies flooded. Where German soldiers siphoned fuel from abandoned vehicles, the Americans simply unloaded another convoy. The shortages became most desperate after 1943. The Allied bombing campaign targeted synthetic fuel plants and oil refineries across Germany, cutting deeply into production. Each raid left storage tanks burning, pipelines shattered, and plants crippled. By the summer of 1944, Luftwaffe pilots sometimes found themselves sent into combat with only enough fuel for a few minutes of flight, forced to break off engagement simply to make it home. Panzer divisions, once symbols of unstoppable power, now faced the humiliation of leaving half their vehicles behind on long marches. Commanders begged for gasoline to mount counterattacks, but the supplies rarely came. The German people felt it, too. Civilian rationing grew harsher. Farmers struggled to bring harvests to market without fuel for tractors or trucks. Bicycles replaced cars on city streets. Families hoarded scraps of wood and coal for heating as petroleum vanished into the war effort. What had once been promised as a Reich of plenty now revealed itself as a nation stretched thin, running on fumes. Still, Hitler clung to the illusion of victory through fuel. In late 1944, he gambled on the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, not only as a military counterstroke but as a desperate grab for Allied fuel depots in Belgium. The offensive's success depended not only on surprise and strength, but on capturing the very gasoline that would keep the tanks moving. German armored spearheads raced toward supply dumps with as much urgency as toward enemy strongpoints. Commanders spoke openly of how victory hinged on seizing the Allies' lifeblood. Without it, even the best-planned offensive would collapse in exhaustion. This obsession with fuel framed the reality of Germany's war by the time late 1944 arrived. Every soldier knew it. Every officer fought against it. And for one colonel in particular, it would take a moment of shocking discovery to see the truth laid bare. When he and his men stumbled upon a massive cache of American fuel, it felt like a miracle. 50,000 gallons, an unimaginable fortune in a war-starved army. But as he stood before it, watching his men rejoice, he realized what it truly meant. This was not salvation. This was proof. Proof that while Germany fought for drops, America swam in oceans. Proof that the war had already been decided, not by tanks or planes alone, but by the industrial lifeblood that kept them moving. The moment of discovery came in the chaos of late 1944, when Germany was launching its last desperate offensive in the Ardennes. For weeks, units had been struggling forward through the thick forests and frozen villages of Belgium, pushing against American lines in a gamble to split the Allies and force a negotiated peace. The plan depended on speed, fast-moving armor, surprise, and the hope that the enemy could be overwhelmed before reinforcements poured in. But already, German commanders were fighting an enemy far deadlier than rifles or artillery, the fuel gauge. Tanks sputtered and stalled, convoys were left stranded by the roadside, and entire divisions found themselves unable to move forward simply because the fuel trucks never arrived. Every German officer knew that the offensive's success depended on capturing American supplies. Without fuel, the panzers were little more than steel coffins parked in the snow. It was in this context that one German colonel led his regiment through the twisting backroads of the Ardennes, skirting villages still smoldering from artillery fire. His men were exhausted, their equipment battered, and their fuel dangerously low. Every kilometer seemed like a gamble, and every driver watched the needle drop with a sense of dread. They were not chasing glory, they were chasing gasoline. Reports had trickled in that American depots lay somewhere ahead, hidden among the forests and valleys. For the colonel, capturing even a few thousand gallons would mean his regiment could keep moving, could keep fighting. It was not ambition, it was survival. The first sign came in the form of a smell. As they neared a clearing, the sharp, unmistakable scent of gasoline carried on the cold air. Soldiers perked up, their fatigue suddenly lifted by the possibility of salvation. The colonel ordered scouts ahead, and within minutes they returned, wide-eyed, confirming what they had seen. Beneath camouflage nets and behind stacks of crates lay row upon row of barrels. Not dozens. Not hundreds. Thousands. American fuel, stored in neat rows, marked and labeled, stretching farther than the eye could count. When the colonel arrived, he stood for a long moment in silence, staring at the mountain of barrels glistening with frost. The reaction among his men was immediate and electric. Shouts rang out as soldiers rushed forward, pounding on the drums, listening to the slosh inside. Some laughed, others cheered, a few even hugged one another. For weeks, their lives had revolved around the slow death of their vehicles, the fear of being stranded in enemy territory with empty tanks. Now, before them, stood what looked like an ocean of salvation. 50,000 gallons, perhaps more, enough to fuel their regiment for weeks, enough to power tanks, trucks, even aircraft if they had them. For a brief moment, it felt like victory. But for the colonel, the feeling was not triumph. It was dread. He walked slowly among the barrels, running his gloved hand over the painted markings, reading the American labels. Each drum represented not desperation, but surplus. The Americans had abandoned this stockpile not because they were careless, but because they had so much fuel that leaving tens of thousands of gallons behind hardly mattered. They could afford to scatter it across the battlefield, to leave caches here and there without worrying if it was lost. For the colonel, that realization was like a blade to the gut. Germany fought for every drop, hoarded every liter, siphoned fuel from wrecks, and rationed tanks to half their potential. And here was the enemy, leaving behind more gasoline than Germany could produce in weeks. His men did not see it that way, not at first. They were busy rolling barrels, filling jerry cans, shouting with relief as engines coughed back to life. Tanks that had sat idle were fueled again, their steel bodies shuddering awake. Trucks lined up to be filled, drivers grinning as they revved engines that had nearly gone silent. The colonel allowed it, knowing their survival demanded it. But inside, he was cold. As he watched, he saw not just fuel, but the larger truth it represented. This cache was a fragment of the American supply system, a single drop from a vast ocean of petroleum that flowed across the Atlantic every day. If the Americans could leave 50,000 gallons here, what must they have in reserve? How many more caches like this lay across France, Belgium, and Luxembourg? And what did it mean for the future of the war? That night, around campfires burning low in the bitter cold, the colonel's officers gathered. They joked about their good fortune, calling it a miracle, a gift from fate. Some spoke with renewed confidence, insisting that perhaps the offensive still had a chance, that with fuel their tanks could break through to Antwerp and split the Allies as Hitler intended. But the colonel listened in silence, staring into the flames. He knew better. He had seen the scale, had felt the weight of those barrels not as hope but as proof of imbalance. Germany could seize this fuel, yes, but the Americans could replace it 100 times over. What they had captured was not a turning point, but a symbol of their own defeat. The next day, as his men pushed forward with tanks freshly fueled, the colonel sat inside his command car, the engine humming steadily thanks to American gasoline. The irony gnawed at him. His regiment moved with borrowed life, propelled not by the Reich's strength but by the enemy's abundance. And he could not shake the image of those endless rows of barrels, standing silent in the frost, waiting to be consumed. 50,000 gallons. Enough to fuel an army, and yet, to the Americans, just another shipment among countless more. For the colonel, it was the moment the truth could no longer be denied: Germany was not simply losing battles. It was being crushed by a scale of production and supply that no courage, no tactics, no miracle could overcome. Engines roared back to life as if the regiment had been resurrected from the dead. Tanks that had sat immobile for days now lurched forward, tracks biting into frozen soil. Trucks belched exhaust, headlights flickering in the mist as convoys rumbled out of the depot with barrels lashed to their beds. Soldiers cheered at the sight, their faces brightened by the simple sound of motion, the sound of fuel coursing through lines and pumps. For weeks they had been creeping through the Ardennes on fumes, every kilometer measured like blood from a wound. Now, for the first time, they moved with power and speed. To the men, it felt like salvation. To the colonel, it was a reprieve with a bitter edge. The regiment surged forward, plunging deeper into the fog-shrouded forest. American positions fell back, surprised by the sudden vigor of German armor. Machine guns rattled from half-tracks, cannons thundered from panthers, and the enemy scrambled to adjust. For a brief moment, the offensive regained its teeth. The colonel's men spoke excitedly, some boasting that perhaps destiny was with them after all. Hitler's promise of a breakthrough to Antwerp did not seem so impossible with fuel in their tanks. Yet every time the colonel glanced at the gauges, every time he watched the steady drain from the barrels in their convoys, the pit in his stomach deepened. They were burning through a gift, not a resource of their own. Every kilometer traveled was another reminder that they lived off the scraps of their enemy. The roads were clogged with movement. German units of every size fought to keep pace, their own tanks and trucks often sputtering empty by the roadside. Fuel-starved divisions watched with envy as the colonel's regiment passed, its vehicles roaring strong. Men shouted for help, waving jerry cans desperately, but there was little to spare. The colonel had to make ruthless decisions, keep his regiment moving or bleed away their advantage to aid others. He chose to press on, though he knew what it meant. They were racing forward on a temporary windfall, trying to carve out success before the tide inevitably turned. As the regiment advanced, the colonel could not help but compare the abundance of the captured depot to the desperation all around him. He remembered the logistical briefings of past years, where officers debated how to stretch a few thousand liters across an entire corps. He remembered tanks in Russia abandoned because fuel never arrived, columns stranded in the mud while the Red Army regrouped. Now, here in the West, history repeated itself, but inverted. The Americans had left behind 50,000 gallons as if it were nothing. And Germany, in its supposed last great offensive, was gambling everything to seize just that. The soldiers did not dwell on such thoughts. They reveled in the moment. Campfires blazed brighter, laughter carried through the winter nights, and engines idled with the luxury of fuel to spare. Trucks ferried barrels forward, their cargo guarded as if it were gold. Mechanics worked tirelessly, patching up damaged vehicles now worth reviving thanks to gasoline flowing freely again. A tank that had been written off days earlier growled back into service, cheered by its crew as though it had returned from the grave. But the colonel, sitting in his command post with maps spread before him, saw a different picture. He traced the thin lines of advance, the overextended route stretching deeper into Belgium. He imagined how quickly those lines could snap once the barrels ran dry. One night, as snow drifted down in heavy silence, he walked among the barrels still stacked in makeshift depots. Lantern light flickered across their curved steel sides, row upon row of American wealth standing in eerie quiet. Guards smoked nearby, stamping their feet against the cold. The colonel paused, resting a gloved hand on one of the drums. The thought gnawed at him again, this was only one cache, abandoned in the haste of retreat. How many more lay across France, the Low Countries, perhaps even behind the very lines they were pushing toward? The Americans fought a war with reserves Germany could scarcely imagine. For them, these barrels were surplus. For him, they were a lifeline. Yet even as he wrestled with the grim implications, the war demanded action. Orders came down from higher command, urging renewed assaults, pressing the attack toward river crossings and key towns. The colonel relayed them dutifully, but he did so with the weight of knowledge his men did not share. They drove forward, believing they carried strength of their own, while he understood they carried only borrowed power. Each explosion that lit the night sky, each village taken in fire and smoke, was fueled by American gasoline. The strain grew heavier with every mile. Fuel trucks at the rear ran constant relays, barrels drained as fast as they could be delivered. Drivers cursed as mud and ice slowed their progress. Tanks fought skirmishes by day and guzzled fuel by night, their appetites insatiable. And though victories came, an American convoy ambushed here, a village seized there, the colonel saw the bigger truth. This was not momentum. It was a flare, bright and fierce, destined to burn out. His officers remained blind to it, or perhaps chose not to see. Around maps they argued strategy, voices high with the optimism of renewed strength. Some claimed that with continued success, perhaps the Americans would be forced to negotiate, perhaps the Reich would survive after all. The colonel listened, silent, then finally spoke. "All of this," he said, pointing to the barrels marked with American paint, "is theirs. Not ours. Remember that." The room fell quiet. No one argued, but no one wanted to believe it either. And so the regiment pressed on, fueled by their miraculous bounty, fighting with the fire of men who thought they had snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. Yet behind every kilometer, every thundering engine, every round fired in anger, the colonel carried the same unshakable realization. What they had captured was not just fuel. It was the measure of a nation's strength. And in that measure, Germany was already beaten. Snow fell thicker as the offensive dragged on, blanketing the forests and villages of the Ardennes in a deceptive calm. Beneath that silence, engines growled and shells cracked, the desperate push of German armor clawing deeper into Belgium. The colonel's regiment, still fueled by the barrels of American gasoline, pressed forward through ruined towns where church spires jutted from smoke and rubble. To the soldiers, the offensive seemed reborn. To the colonel, every fresh advance was haunted by the knowledge that their momentum was not born of Germany's strength but of their enemy's abundance. Still, orders demanded action, and the regiment threw itself at the front, burning through its borrowed lifeline. The Ardennes was a brutal battlefield. Narrow roads twisted through dense forests, choked with wreckage and ice. Tanks slid across frozen ground, their treads fighting for purchase, while trucks clogged the paths, headlights dimmed under blackout orders. American resistance stiffened with every passing day. At first, the surprise attack had thrown them back in confusion, but now reinforcements poured in, infantry dug into snowy fields, artillery booming from ridgelines, armored columns countering the German thrust. The colonel watched it unfold with grim precision. His regiment struck, fought, and pushed forward, but every victory cost more fuel, more barrels drained, more of the precious bounty consumed. In one village, his men ambushed an American convoy, capturing more trucks and supplies. The soldiers celebrated, filling their canteens with coffee and chocolate taken from enemy rations. They joked that fortune favored them, that perhaps God himself had decided to bless their fight. The colonel remained unmoved. He saw the convoy not as a miracle but as another reminder of disparity. The Americans lost trucks and men, yes, but he knew within days those losses would be replaced. Factories across the Atlantic would churn out more vehicles, more ammunition, more gasoline than Germany could ever hope to match. For every barrel they captured here, 100 more were already waiting in some depot beyond their reach. The weather became its own enemy. Blizzard swept across the Ardennes, grounding aircraft and coating roads in ice. Soldiers huddled in their foxholes, their breath steaming in the cold, rifles clutched tight as snow buried the wreckage of vehicles. In the colonel's command post, maps lay scattered across tables, their arrows of advance stretching thin and fragile. Reports came in of stalled tanks, not from enemy fire but from empty fuel lines. Mechanics tried to siphon the last drops from abandoned vehicles, desperate to keep others moving. The irony was sharp. After capturing 50,000 gallons, after watching engines roar with renewed life, the regiment was again running dry. Conversations among the officers grew strained. Some argued for pressing harder, insisting that if they could just break through to the Meuse River, the Americans might falter. Others spoke quietly of retreat, of conserving what little remained. The colonel listened, his face lined with exhaustion, his thoughts circling back to that depot of barrels gleaming in the frost. That moment had been more than a reprieve, it had been a revelation. Germany was playing at war with scraps, while the enemy waged it with oceans. Yet he did not say it aloud again. His men fought with hope, and he would not rob them of it, even if hope itself felt like a lie. On the front lines, the regiment's tanks battled in snow-choked fields, their guns booming against American Shermans. Soldiers pressed through forests, rifles cracking, grenades bursting in the frozen underbrush. The colonel rode forward in his command car, watching as smoke rose from burning villages. He saw the determination in his men's faces, the grit in their movements. They fought as though victory was still possible, as though Antwerp lay just beyond the next ridge. But he could not shake the image of gauges falling, barrels emptied, engines sputtering silent in the cold. Each mile gained was another mile closer to collapse. By Christmas, the offensive that had begun with such ferocity was slowing to a crawl. Fuel trucks at the rear ran dry. Tanks were abandoned where they stopped, their hulks frozen in place like tombstones. Soldiers trudged on foot, carrying rifles but lacking the mechanized power that had driven them only days before. The colonel stood by the roadside as one of his prized Panthers sputtered to a halt, its crew cursing as they climbed out, steam rising from the exhaust like a dying breath. He placed a hand on the cold steel, knowing it would not move again. It was not enemy fire that had killed it, but the absence of the one resource they could never capture enough of. American counterattacks grew bolder. Columns of Shermans rolled forward, their turrets swinging with confidence, backed by artillery that never seemed to fall silent. Overhead, once the skies cleared, waves of Allied aircraft returned, their bomb loads tearing apart roads and convoys. The German offensive faltered not only from resistance but from the simple fact that it could not be sustained. The colonel gave orders, repositioned units, tried to salvage what strength remained, but deep down he knew the truth. What had begun as a bold gamble was dissolving into exhaustion. At night, as the men huddled in their freezing barracks, the colonel walked alone. The snow crunched beneath his boots, the forest looming black and silent around him. He thought of the barrels again, stacked row upon row, their markings bold and clear under the winter sun. He remembered the sound of fuel sloshing inside, the sight of soldiers laughing as they refueled their tanks. And he remembered the sinking realization that the Americans could leave such wealth behind without concern. That contrast haunted him now, more than the rumble of artillery or the reports of advancing enemy forces. The regiment still fought, still clawed at the enemy with everything it had. But with each passing day, the colonel understood more clearly that the war was slipping away, not because of bravery or cowardice, but because of a chasm of resources that could not be bridged. 50,000 gallons had bought them time, but it had also shown them a glimpse of the impossible scale arrayed against them. And as the snow continued to fall, covering wrecks and bodies alike, the colonel felt the weight of that truth pressing heavier than the winter itself. The winter sun rose pale over the Ardennes, glinting off wrecks that lined the roads like steel skeletons. The colonel's regiment, once roaring forward with the fury of renewed life, now crawled back in retreat. Engines sputtered, some vehicles towed by horses, others abandoned in ditches when the last drops of fuel were gone. Soldiers marched silently beside the empty hulks, their boots crunching through snow stained with soot and ash. The offensive that had begun with thunder now faded with a whimper, undone not only by the resistance of the enemy but by the invisible hand of exhaustion. Every man felt it. Every step forward now seemed borrowed, every bullet fired a measure of dwindling time. News trickled in from across the front, the great Ardennes offensive had failed. The panzers had not reached Antwerp, the Allies had not been split. Instead, American reinforcements poured in, their convoys endless, their skies blackened with aircraft. German formations, starving for fuel and ammunition, fell back in fragments. The colonel read the reports by lantern light in his field headquarters, his jaw tightening with each line. He had known from the moment he saw those barrels stacked in the snow that their mission was impossible. Now the truth was written not just in his mind but in the blood of his regiment, in the wrecks rusting in the snow. Still, the war demanded motion, demanded sacrifice. Retreat was not surrender but another struggle to preserve what remained. The colonel ordered rearguard actions, delaying tactics, ambushes set in the forests. His men fought with the same ferocity they had shown in the advance, but their battles were fueled now by desperation rather than gasoline. In one village, they dug in among ruined houses, holding back American infantry for hours before slipping away into the night. In another, they destroyed their own vehicles, setting them ablaze rather than leaving them for the enemy. The flames lit the sky with a grim glow, illuminating the hollow faces of men who had fought hard but knew they were beaten. The contrast between armies could not have been clearer. American convoys rumbled forward on roads that seemed endlessly supplied, their tanks brimming with fuel, their soldiers eating hot meals even at the front. Overhead, fighter-bombers prowled with the arrogance of dominance, striking any German movement caught in the open. Meanwhile, the colonel's men shared scraps of food, gnawed on frozen bread, and huddled together for warmth in barns and cellars. Every day became a reminder of imbalance, one side fighting with abundance, the other with remnants. Among the soldiers, whispers spread. Some cursed their leaders for launching the offensive at all, calling it madness to believe they could win against such strength. Others clung to fragments of hope, speaking of miracle weapons, of political fractures among the Allies, of some twist of fate that might still save them. The colonel listened in silence, never encouraging the fantasies but never crushing them either. He knew morale was as fragile as fuel. To take away belief was to extinguish the last fire left in their hearts. Yet in his own mind, the verdict was sealed. He thought again of the depot, of the moment his hand touched those barrels. That was the war in miniature, Germany clawing for what America could afford to leave behind. As the regiment pulled back through shattered towns, they passed civilians huddled in ruins, their faces pinched with hunger. The colonel saw children wrapped in rags, mothers scavenging wood from collapsed roofs, old men staring blankly at the soldiers as they trudged by. It reminded him of home, of the letters he had received from his own family, describing shortages, bombings, fear. He imagined the contrast: across the ocean, American towns with glowing lights, bustling markets, trains overflowing with goods. Here, only ashes and silence. That disparity struck him harder than any artillery barrage. It was not just the battlefield that was lost, it was the foundation of their nation itself. One night, sitting in a ruined farmhouse, the colonel spread his maps across a broken table. The lines of the front were collapsing, bending under the weight of American and British counterattacks. His officers spoke around him, their voices tight with fatigue, some demanding orders, others arguing about supplies. He let them talk, his eyes fixed on the paper. The arrows of advance, once bold and red, now seemed meaningless scratches against the reality outside. He thought of his men, of the tanks rusting by the roadside, of the 50,000 gallons that had once seemed like a miracle. It had been enough to move them forward, enough to light the fire for a few fleeting days. But it had also revealed the truth of the war in its starkest form: Germany was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting for time. And time was running out. When the order finally came to withdraw fully, the colonel stood in the snow with his men, watching as the last of their fuel was poured into a handful of trucks. The engines growled weakly, their exhaust curling into the cold air. He looked at their faces, young and old, hardened and hollowed, and knew what they did not say aloud. They were soldiers without an army, fighters in a war already decided. They would keep moving, keep fighting, because duty demanded it. But somewhere deep within, they all understood what he had realized when he first saw those American barrels: the war was lost, not in the clash of armies, but in the endless reservoirs of oil and steel that Germany could never match. As the convoy rolled out, the colonel lingered a moment longer. The snow fell softly, muffling the sounds of retreat, covering the wrecks and corpses with a blanket of false peace. He closed his eyes, hearing in memory the laughter of his men when they first found the fuel, the roar of engines as they surged forward, the fragile spark of hope that had burned so briefly. Then he turned and walked away, his boots leaving prints that the falling snow quickly erased. History often remembers battles, generals, and great turning points. But sometimes, it's in the small moments: one man staring at 50,000 gallons of fuel, that the larger truth becomes clear. The Reich could not win a war against an enemy that had turned oil into an endless weapon. The German colonel's silent realization was not just about one cache of fuel. It was about the war itself. In that moment, he saw the future, and he knew it belonged not to Germany, but to the industrial might of the United States.